Section 1.6, we're going to be talking about multiplying and dividing real numbers. So again, just working with positives and negatives like we did with adding and subtracting. So before we jump into any examples, let's go through the rules. So first one, if we have a positive times a positive, we always end up with a positive. A negative times a negative still equals a positive. And a positive times a negative equals a negative. So a little different than when you're adding and subtracting. It doesn't depend on which one's larger. It's just always going to be a negative, which makes it a little bit nicer, just a little bit more confusing because you have to kind of remember this rule versus the other rule. Two other things I want to write down here. If we have some number, we'll call it x times 0. We always get 0. Same thing if we have 0 times some number, still get 0. So that's going to make those questions with a 0 really nice and fast. All right, let's look at some examples. Number 1 here, we have 7 times negative 8. Positive times a negative, we get a negative, so negative 56. Number 2, negative 9 times 2. Negative times a positive, we get a negative 18. These are going to be really fast. It just might be the multiplication that takes a little bit longer. Number 3, negative 16 times 5 over 32. So this one here, we're still dealing with a negative times a positive, so it's still negative. But now we're going to go ahead and rewrite this one. So let's go ahead and change this to a negative 16 over 1. And then I'm going to reduce first, because I don't want to have to deal with multiplying 16 times 5 and then reducing that over 32. So 16 goes into both 16 and 32, so I'll divide both of those by 16. This one becomes a 1. That negative is still with it. I'm just going to leave it there. This becomes a 2. So on top we have negative 1. We already took care of the negative here, so we'll just count this as a 1 times 5, which is 5. 1 times 2 is 2, so negative 5 halves. Number 4, negative 5 times negative 6. Negative times a negative is a positive 30. Negative 3 times negative 7. Negative times a negative is a positive 21. And lastly, negative 1/7 times negative 5 halves. So again, negative times a negative is a positive, and there's nothing to reduce here, so I'm just going to go ahead and multiply straight across. So we get 1 times 5 is 5, 7 times 2 is 14. All right, so those first ones are pretty straightforward. We need one quick definition before we get into division. So this definition is for a reciprocal. So reciprocals, and S there, are numbers whose product is 1. And so reading that definition, it's not super clear what we mean by reciprocals, so let's look at a couple of examples. Reciprocals basically it's just when we're going to flip a fraction. So if we have 2/3, the reciprocal of this is going to be 3/2. Let's say we have 5, not as clear what the reciprocal of this one's going to be, but if we think of this as 5 over 1, we get 1/5. And if we have negative 3, again, think of it as negative 3 over 1, flip that and we get negative 1/3, or 1 over negative 3. But for these, keep the sign. We're not multiplying, we're not taking absolute value, we're just flipping the fraction. And so for division, the reason why we want to talk about reciprocals is that let's say we have x divided by y. These are going to be different ways of writing division. We've already seen that we can write this as x over y. And we can think of this as x times the reciprocal of y, or 1 over y. And so division is just multiplying by the reciprocal, which is what we saw when we looked at dividing fractions. We changed it to multiplication and flipped the second fraction. All we were doing was multiplying by the reciprocal. All right, so let's go ahead and look at just the rules really fast. They're the same rules as multiplication, but let's go ahead and just write these down. So same sign rules as multiplication. So if we have a positive divided by a positive, we get a positive. A positive over a negative, or a negative over a positive equals a negative. And lastly, a negative divided by a negative. I'm going to put that in parentheses just so you can see that those are negatives. Negative over a negative is a positive. All right, so some examples. They're going to be nice, fast examples like the last ones were. Number 1, negative 8 over negative 2. Negative divided by negative is a positive. 8 divided by 2 is 4. Number 2, 12 divided by negative 4. Positive divided by negative is a negative. 12 divided by 4 is 3, so negative 3. And lastly, 1/4 divided by negative 2/3. So still working with fractions here. So we need to think of our fraction rules when we're dividing. We need to skip, flip, multiply. So keep that 1/4, change this to multiplication, and we're going to find the reciprocal of negative 2/3. Make sure the negative stays and just flip that fraction. And so now, if we go ahead and multiply, we have a positive times a negative is a negative. Make sure you're thinking of this number as a whole. This whole thing is negative. This whole fraction here is positive. And then we'll just multiply straight across because there's nothing to reduce. So 1 times 3 is 3. 4 times 2 is 8. So negative 3/8. All right, so those ones aren't too bad. The only other rule we have for division is when we're dividing with 0. All right, so dividing with 0, a couple of rules. If we have 0 divided by some number, this is just going to give us 0. So think of this if we had, say, 0 divided by 5. 5 goes into 0 times, so it's just 0. But if we have some number divided by 0, let's think about this one by looking at an example. Let's say we have 10 divided by 0. So we want to know how many times does 10 or 0 go into 10? Well, if we had 10 divided by 2, we would get 5 because we can count up by 2 5 times to get to 10. But if we have 0 going into 10, we can't count up by zeros to get to 10, so we would never make it there. We can count an infinite number of times by 0 and never get to 10. And so this one is what we call undefined. It's just not possible to find this answer. All right, so this next section of examples is going to be a little bit of review from our last section where we were looking at some addition and subtraction with real numbers, and we're going to bring that together with multiplying and dividing with real numbers. These are those longer questions that have order of operations in them. -3 times 4 minus 2 times 6. All right, so sometimes there's going to be more than one way that you can kind of write these negatives out, and it just depends on personal preference. I'll show you the way that I like to do these. So I'm going to group our multiplication together and do those at the same time. Keep that minus sign in the middle. So -3 times 4, negative times a positive is a -12. Bring over the minus, and then 2 times 6 is 12. The other way you can think about this is -2 times 6, which gives us a -12. Just gets a little bit more confusing. If we had ended up with a positive 12, you'd have to remember to put a plus sign there. So I don't like that way as much as doing the multiplication and then focus on that sign in the middle separately. All right, so now -12 minus 12, we're going to go ahead and add the opposite because we have subtraction. So -12 plus a -12, negative plus a negative gives us a negative. 12 plus 12 is 24. So you really have to keep those sign rules different from one another. Addition is different than if we were multiplying two negatives. All right, number 2. -8 bracket -1 minus -4 times -5. So I put both of those in parentheses because they both have negatives. And now we have a grouping symbol, so we know we have to work inside the brackets first. We have subtraction and we have multiplication. So let's go ahead and do this multiplication, and I'm going to leave everything else the same. So I'll bring over -8 bracket -1 minus -4 times -5. Negative times the negative is a positive 20. We still have that minus because of the minus in between. Still working inside that grouping symbol, let's go ahead and add the opposite. And now -1 plus -20, bring over the -8 in front. I'll leave the bracket because that's our multiplication. And a negative plus a negative gives us a -21. And now finally multiplying -8 times -21. You can always multiply that off to the side if you want to. You don't have to, but we get a positive 168. Number 3, 6 times -2 plus the absolute value of 3 times 3 minus 11. All right, so a couple different things going on here. We have a group from our absolute value, some multiplication in the front. We want to do everything inside the grouping symbols first. You can technically do this multiplication at the same time because they're not affecting each other, but I'm just going to focus on the group to really break this down. So I'm going to leave this 6 times -2 in the front, plus absolute value, because we're going to do that as when we have a single number on the inside. And now in this group, we're going to do 3 times 3 first. So we're going to have 9 minus 11. And now still working within the group, let's go ahead and add the opposite. So I'll leave that 6 times -2 in the front. And now still have the absolute value, 9 plus -11, opposite sign, so we subtract, keep the larger sign, so -2. This is technically still a grouping symbol, so I'm going to go ahead and completely simplify that, and then I'll multiply. So I'll keep 6 times -2 plus the absolute value of -2 is 2. And now we can multiply and add. So 6 times -2, opposite sign, so we get a -12 plus 2. It's addition, so we don't have to change any subtraction signs. Opposite sign, so we subtract, get 10, take the sign of the larger number, so -10. All right, so now this final one, number 4, is going to be a big fraction. So we're going to have 6 times -4 minus 2 times 5 all over 3 times the quantity of 2 minus 7, or times the difference of 2 minus 7, like you might see in the word problems. All right, so 2 different groups here at the top and the bottom of the fraction, so we can simplify them at the same time. So at the top, I'm going to multiply here, and I'll multiply the 2 times 5, and then we'll subtract those 2. 6 times -4, we get positive times a negative is a -24, minus 2 times 5 is 10. And now on the bottom, I'm going to simplify inside this group first. So we're going to have 3 parentheses. And now 2 minus 7, subtraction, so I'll change it to adding the opposite. And 2 plus a -7, opposite signs, so subtract. Take the sign of the larger number, so we get -5. And now on top here, we have subtraction, so I'm going to change this to adding the opposites. So -24 plus -10, adding 2 negatives, we get a -34. And 3 times -5 is going to give us -15. And so even though we can't reduce here, there is one last thing we want to do. You always want to kind of simplify as much as possible. Even if it doesn't look like you're doing a whole lot, a negative over a negative is a positive. So we can go ahead and change this to positive 34/15. All right, for these examples, we want to evaluate. And so these were those problems we saw when you're given an expression and you're given certain values for x and y, and you want to go ahead and plug them in. So number 1, we're given 2x minus 7 parentheses y plus 1. And we're given the values x equals -4 and y equals 3. So now we're going to go ahead and plug these in. The one big thing here, when you're plugging in a negative, we'll plug this 3 in over here, always put parentheses around negative numbers when you plug them in. So we're going to have 2 times x, or 2 parentheses -4. It's natural to do it here because we're multiplying, but when we get to some exponents in a second, it's not as natural to put parentheses, but you want them so that you can simplify them correctly. And now -7 parentheses y is 3 plus 1. And now it's a matter of simplifying. So first thing I'll do here is simplify the group. And I'll leave everything else the same. So 2 times -4 minus 7 parentheses 3 plus 1 is 4. 2 sets of multiplication, I'll just do them at the same time. 2 times -4 is going to give us -8, minus 7 times 4 is 28. And now our last step here, we want to add the opposite. And -8 plus -28, they're both negative, so they give us a negative when we add. And we get -36. All right, one more of these. This one's a little bit trickier because we're going to be dealing with exponents, and this is where a lot of the mistakes tend to happen with our negatives. So we're given 2x squared minus 4y squared, and we're told to evaluate for x equals -2 and y equals -3. So they're both negatives. And one thing to keep in mind here, we're plugging this -2 in for x, plugging this -3 in for y. So this entire -2 here, or sorry, this entire x is becoming -2. We're going to put this -2 in parentheses. And so what you can do before you actually plug anything in is replace all of your variables with empty sets of parentheses. So what I mean by that is I'll leave this 2 out in front. We have an x, so parentheses, it's being squared, make sure that goes on the outside. Minus 4, we have a y, so parentheses, square on the outside. And then fill in your numbers, that way you know you're going to put parentheses around your negatives. So -2 here, -3 here. And now the order of operations is another place where people tend to make mistakes, just because it's really easy to want to go from left to right and multiply first. Always do exponents before you multiply. So, oops, didn't want that one there. We want to evaluate our exponents, so I'll leave the 2 out in front. We're multiplying it by -2 squared, which is -2 times -2, so +4. And then -4 times -3 times -3, which is 9. And now we can go ahead and multiply these. So 2 times 4 is 8, minus 4 times 9 is 36. Subtraction, so add the opposite. And we can go ahead and subtract, take the sign of the larger number. And if we go ahead and subtract those, we get -28. All right, so big things there, just make sure you're putting your negatives in parentheses when you plug them in, and make sure that you evaluate your exponents before you multiply. All right, so now our last set of examples here, we're gonna do some more kind of word to numerical expression questions. So we want to go ahead and write a numerical expression. Or equation, so we're going to see both here. And then we want to simplify expressions. So we're not going to do anything with the equations because we didn't get to solving those yet. So number 1, we have the product of 6 and the sum of -5 and -4. So let's go ahead and break this one down. So product means we're going to multiply. Sum means we're going to add. And we have the sum of -4 and -5. So remember, always group those together. So I'm going to go ahead and write that one down first. So sum of, and I'll use brackets because we're going to want parentheses around that -4. So sum -5 plus -4. And we want the product of this and 6. So let's go ahead and just put that 6 right in front for multiplication. And now they want us to simplify, so let's go ahead and simplify the inside first. We'll leave that 6 outside. -5 plus -4, 2 negatives adding give us another negative, -9. And then if we multiply, we get -54. All right, let's go ahead and try another one. 3 times the difference. of 4 and -6. So this is another one of those where we have the difference of, and I'm going to go ahead and put those in parentheses. So we want to group those, and we want that difference 3 times. So we're going to do that difference first, and I'll put it in brackets because we're working with more negatives. Difference means subtraction. So we want to go ahead and subtract 4 and -6. So 4 minus -6 in parentheses. And then we want 3 times this difference. So I'm going to multiply this by 3. So now when we go ahead and simplify, we're going to add the opposite. So we have 4 plus 6 times 3. So we're going to have 3 brackets 10. And 3 times 10 is 30. And then just a couple more of these. Let's go ahead and look at one more expression before we do a couple of equations. We have 3/5 of the sum of 2 and -7. So again, we have the sum of 2 and -7. So another negative, I'll use brackets here. So the sum of, so 2 plus -7. And then we want 3/5 of this. Whenever you see 3/5 of something or a half of something, this means that we want to multiply. So we're going to multiply this by 3/5. And then we're just going to go through and simplify like we just did. So let's go ahead and simplify inside those group. So we have 3/5 bracket 2 plus -7, opposite sign. So we're going to go ahead and subtract and keep the sign of the larger number. So -5. And then multiplying these, I'm going to write this number as a fraction. So we have 3/5 times -5 over 1. And now before we multiply, I'm going to go ahead and just cancel out these 5s or make them both 1s. And positive times a negative is a negative. And then multiply straight across. We have 3 times 1 is 3 over 1 times 1, which is just 1. And you don't want to leave it like this. This isn't considered reduced. -3 over 1 is just -3. All right, so these last two here are a little bit shorter just because there's no simplifying to do. Number 4, we're given twice a number. And notice how we have a number, so we don't know what the number is. We'll probably just call it x or whatever other variable you want to use, is -6. So again, anytime you see the word is, this means that we have an equal sign here. So we have our equal sign, the right side is -6, and the left side is twice a number. Twice something means we're multiplying it by 2, so 2x equals -6. And we'll leave it just like that. So we're not solving these quite yet. And finally, the last one, the quotient of a number and -2 is 6. So again, find our word, our keyword here is for our equal sign. The right side is just going to be 6, so equals 6. Quotient means that we're dividing. So we want to go ahead and write this, not using the division symbol because it doesn't look as nice when we have variables. Let's go ahead and use a fraction. So the quotient of a number in -2 means we're dividing. So we're going to have a number x divided by -2 equals 6. All right, so next time we'll go ahead and take a look at some properties of numbers. We've already talked about them a little bit, and then we'll start getting into some more algebra-based stuff.